Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The wind howled relentlessly, biting through the cracks in the old wooden shutters of the Fisherman's Arms, a weathered inn perched precariously on the edge of the coast. Its timbers creaked as the night stretched on, making it seem alive as though it too was trying to escape the grasp of the storm. The sea beyond the cliffs roared angrily, waves crashing against the rocks with a fury only nature could muster. Inside the inn, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. A handful of patrons huddled at tables, nursing their drinks and murmuring softly, their faces pale from the cold outside. At one of those tables sat Miss Jane Marple, a quiet observer of the world around her, her sharp eyes watching the unfolding drama with quiet interest. The sheriff, a thick-set man with a ruddy face, entered the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He glanced around, his eyes resting on Miss Marple before making his way to the bar, where the landlord stood polishing glasses. "You've heard, then?" the sheriff muttered, his voice tight with worry. "Not a word, Sheriff." The landlord replied, his brow furrowed. "But if it's about the Lighthouse, I've heard the rumors. Ain't no good, that place. Never has been." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Aye, well, it's no rumor anymore. There's been a murder." Miss Marple's interest piqued and she set down her cup of tea, her hands steady as she observed the conversation. She had been to St. Mary's Cove before, a small coastal village that appeared to be stuck in time. The old lighthouse had always been a subject of gossip among the locals, but such things were usually dismissed as fanciful tales. This, however, was different. The sheriff turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple, I don't suppose you'd be willing to lend a hand with a case that's already baffled us all." Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint smile. "I believe I could be of some assistance. Though I must say, I'd rather not venture out in this storm. Perhaps we could wait for morning." The sheriff's face tightened. "The crime scene is at the lighthouse. No one else is willing to go near it, and we don't have much time before the storm worsens. I'm afraid I must insist." Miss Marple nodded and rose slowly, her feet steady beneath her. "I'll get my shawl." The wind howled louder as they made their way outside. The path leading to the lighthouse was treacherous, slippery with mud and rocks, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. The sheriff led the way, his lantern casting an eerie glow ahead. But Miss Marple had no difficulty keeping pace, her steps sure and unhurried. As they neared the lighthouse, the first thing that struck her was the absence of sound. The relentless crashing of waves had stopped, leaving only a silence that seemed unnatural, as though the very world was holding its breath. The lighthouse towered over them, its stone walls dark and foreboding against the dim sky. It was as though it were an ancient sentinel, watching over the village with a gaze that never blinked. The sheriff led Miss Marple inside, the heavy wooden door creaking as they pushed it open. The interior was dim, lit only by a single flickering lamp in the corner. A man lay sprawled on the floor, his body twisted in an unnatural position. Blood stained the flagstone floor, pooling around him in dark patches. He was dressed in the worn clothing of a fisherman, though the sight of him was unsettling in its stillness. Miss Marple crouched beside him, her keen eyes scanning the scene. The sheriff, his face pale, watched her closely. "Do you see anything?" he asked. Miss Marple examined the body, her gaze flickering from the man to the surroundings. The room was empty aside from the body and the odd assortment of furniture. An old desk, a few chairs, and a cluttered shelf. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the feeling in the air was wrong, thick with tension. "Look at the man's hand," Miss Marple said quietly, pointing to the corpse's right hand. The sheriff's eyes followed her gesture, narrowing when he saw the peculiar detail. The man's fingers were wrapped around something, a scrap of paper. It appeared to be a torn piece of map, but the ink was smudged and difficult to read. The sheriff gingerly pried the paper from the dead man's hand and held it up to the light. The piece of paper had a crude, hastily drawn mark on it, a circle with an X in the center. Beneath it, the ink was blurred and almost indecipherable. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "It's not a clue, not really," she said, more to herself than to the sheriff. "It's a message. But who was it meant for?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "That's just it. We've had no word of any strangers in the area, and the only people who come to the lighthouse are the men who tend it. But they're all accounted for. This man, though, he wasn't one of them. And yet he had the map," Miss Marple murmured. She straightened up, her eyes scanning the room once more. Was there anything else? Anything at all? The sheriff shifted nervously, his gaze flickering around the room. "Nothing, Miss Marple, nothing out of the ordinary." "Then we must assume the map is the key," Miss Marple said softly. "We need to find out where it leads." The sheriff took a step back. "That's all well and good, but how do we even know it's real, or what it means?" Miss Marple turned, her eyes fixed on him. "The answer is in the man's death. We just need to figure out what message he was trying to send." The sheriff, his face a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect, nodded. "I'll gather the men and see if anyone recognizes the map. But Miss Marple, I don't have high hopes. This case has all the markings of one that will stay unsolved." "You underestimate me, Sheriff," Miss Marple said with a smile. "It is only unsolved if you don't know where to look." The sheriff hesitated before giving a curt nod. "I'll have the men begin searching. We'll see if anything turns up." But Miss Marple wasn't listening. Her mind was already working, running through possibilities. She could feel the puzzle pieces falling into place. This crime was not impossible. It was simply intricate. And in its own way, it would be a pleasure to unravel. The storm's intensity only grew as the sheriff left Miss Marple alone in the lighthouse, his footsteps echoing against the stone floors. She remained in the stillness, allowing herself a few moments to observe. The air was thick with the scent of dampness, but there was something else in the room, something heavier. She could sense it, like a whisper behind a closed door. Something was being hidden. Her gaze shifted back to the body on the floor. The torn map had been carefully placed in the dead man's hand. But it was more than that. It was the way he had been positioned. No wild struggle, no sign of frantic movement, only a single decisive strike to the chest. A clean wound. A professional's touch, perhaps. Yet the absence of blood spatter, the peculiar absence of a weapon, and the quiet manner in which the body had been left suggested one thing. This had been a deliberate message. But to whom? Miss Marple stood up, glancing around once more. The lamp in the corner flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, as though the room itself was closing in. She crossed to the desk, her fingers brushing lightly over the old, dust-covered papers. A faint sound reached her ears. A soft scraping sound from the far side of the room. The noise seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. She bent down, her fingers tracing the edge of a floorboard, near the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. Something was off. The board did not sit as it should. With the quietest of movements, she pried it loose, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, there was a weathered notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Miss Marple took the book, her eyes scanning it quickly. It was a log of sorts, filled with names, dates, and numbers, cryptic entries that seemed entirely disconnected from the crime at hand. But there was one entry that caught her eye. The date matched the night the man had been killed. Her mind raced as she flipped through the pages, the careful notations suddenly making sense. The man had been keeping track of something. Perhaps he had stumbled upon information that someone had wanted kept quiet. Perhaps he had been killed for it. The notebook was a puzzle, but the pieces were scattered. Miss Marple set it down carefully and began to consider her next move. As she stood up, the door creaked open, and the sheriff returned, accompanied by 2 of his deputies. They had begun their search of the grounds, their heavy boots making quick work of the entrance hall. One of the deputies, a younger man with nervous eyes, approached Miss Marple and nodded awkwardly. "Sheriff's got a theory," the deputy muttered, his voice strained. "Says it's some sort of robbery gone wrong." Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the young man's face, her expression softening. "And you believe that, do you?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the sheriff. "It makes sense, doesn't it? A fisherman. He might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, ever so slightly. There was something in the deputy's voice, an edge, a hint of guilt, that she couldn't ignore. She turned her attention back to the sheriff, who was carefully examining the body. "I trust you found nothing of interest, Sheriff?" she asked, her tone light. The sheriff glanced up, his expression grim. "Nothing worth mentioning. Just the usual things. A man, his personal effects. A life ended too soon." Miss Marple inclined her head, her mind already working. "You?" "No," she said, stepping toward the body. "The fisherman's watch is missing. But his boots are still here, and they're quite expensive. Odd, considering his station." The sheriff's brows furrowed as he looked down at the man's feet. I didn't notice that. Not much of a lead, though." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed. "But then there's the matter of his coat." The sheriff blinked. "What about it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric. "It's too clean. There's no sign of any salt water or dirt. Not a speck, despite the storm. You'd think, in a place like this, that the wind and spray would have left something." The sheriff's frown deepened. "Could have been wiped down." "Could be," Miss Marple replied, "but I don't think so. The fabric is too stiff. It wasn't worn long, and it wasn't worn hard." The sheriff scowled, clearly growing frustrated. "Miss Marple, I don't know what you're implying. You think this man was... what? An imposter?" She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Not an imposter, no. But someone else entirely, yes. You see, there's an oddity here. The man's death is staged to look like something it's not. But it's not just the body we need to focus on, is it?" The sheriff, clearly out of his depth, looked to his deputies for any clarity, but none offered any answers. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Then what do you suggest?" I suggest you focus on the others who might be involved, Miss Marple said, her voice calm. The fisherman's log is a starting point. It's almost certain that the man was not alone in whatever he was trying to uncover. Before the sheriff could respond, the young deputy, who had been fidgeting nervously in the corner, spoke up. There's someone who might know more, he said hesitantly. We saw him on the way in. He's a local. Fisherman too, or used to be. Goes by the name of Old Enoch. He lives in a shack not far from here. Been talking a lot lately about something he saw at the lighthouse. The sheriff gave a dismissive grunt. Enoch's a fool. Half his teeth are gone, and the other half seemed to be permanently half-drunken. What could he know? Miss Marple, however, turned her full attention to the deputy. Take me to him, she said simply. The deputy's eyes widened. Ma'am? Take me to him now, Miss Marple repeated, her voice unwavering. If there is someone who knows what happened, here it is. I can feel it. Without waiting for another word, she turned and walked toward the door, a movement swift and purposeful. The sheriff hesitated, but finally motioned for the deputy to lead the way. As they left the lighthouse behind, the wind seemed to echo, with a promise. Something far deeper was at play here, something far more sinister than a simple robbery gone awry, and Miss Marple was closing in on it. The walk to Old Enoch's shack was a short one, though it felt longer than it should have. The wind carrying with it the scent of rain and the eerie stillness of the coastal night. The deputy led the way, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, and Miss Marple kept a steady pace, her sharp eyes scanning everything with quiet precision. The village seemed even quieter now, as though the storm had swallowed the sounds of life, leaving only whispers in its wake. The shack, when they arrived, was little more than a rickety structure, its walls sagging as though they had long since given up the fight against the elements. A dim light flickered from inside, casting a faint glow through the cracked windows. The deputy knocked once, and after a long moment the door creaked open. Enoch stood there, an old man with a grizzled beard and rheumy eyes, his clothing patched and stained from years of use. His face, once sharp, had softened with age, but there was a wildness in his gaze that told Miss Marple that this was not a man to be underestimated. "What's all this about, eh?" Enoch grumbled, his voice low and rasping. "Can't a man get some peace in his old age? What do you want?" "We're investigating the death of a man at the lighthouse," the deputy said quickly, his words stumbling over themselves. "The sheriff, well, he said you might know something about it." Enoch's eyes flickered with recognition, though he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he squinted at Miss Marple, as though weighing her presence. He said after a long pause. "I know something. Something I shouldn't have seen, maybe." He stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. Inside the shack was dimly lit, its interior cluttered with a mishmash of old fishing gear, crates, and various knickknacks that had been hoarded over the years. The faint smell of brine and mold hung in the air, mixing with the smoke from a tiny stove in the corner. "Sit," Enoch muttered, sinking into a chair by the fire. "What do you want to know?" The deputy glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded slightly, signaling him to ask the first question. "We heard you were near the lighthouse the night the man was killed. Can you tell us what you saw?" Enoch scratched his beard, his eyes distant, as though he were trying to remember something. "Far removed from this world. Saw a man. He said slowly. Couldn't tell who it was. It was too dark, and the wind, it was howling so fierce. But I saw someone leave, leaving something behind. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but intent. What did they leave behind? Enoch hesitated, his eyes flicking to the deputy, then back to Miss Marple. A coat, he muttered. Not his, too fine, too new. Wasn't the kind of coat you'd expect a fisherman to wear. I didn't get a good look at the man who left it, but I saw the coat. And the way it was tossed aside like it didn't matter. Coat? The deputy repeated, confused. Are you sure? Couldn't it have been anything else? Enoch grunted, leaning forward slightly, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. I know what I saw. It was no ordinary coat, and it wasn't meant to be left behind. It was a message, I think. A message from someone who didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A message, she repeated, her voice thoughtful. And who was this man? Did you recognize him at all? Enoch shifted uneasily in his chair. I can't rightly say. Too many shadows, too much wind. But it wasn't a local, I know that much. He was too clean, too polished. Fishermen don't look like that, especially not on a night like that. The deputy stepped forward, his brow furrowed. You're not saying this wasn't the man who was found dead at the lighthouse, are you? Enoch gave a small, mocking chuckle. I'm saying nothing of the sort. I don't know who the dead man was. But I saw someone leave, and I didn't see anyone come back. That's all I know. Miss Marple observed the old man carefully. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of unease, something he wasn't saying. But she didn't press him further. Instead, she nodded politely. Thank you for your time, Enoch, she said, rising from her chair. We may need to speak to you again. The deputy gave the old man a final suspicious glance and followed Miss Marple out the door. As they walked away from the shack, Miss Marple's mind raced. She wasn't certain about Enoch's story. There was truth in it, yes, but there was also something he was deliberately holding back. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew more than he was willing to admit. The wind had picked up again, and the storm now seemed as if it might tear the very earth from beneath them. But Miss Marple walked with purpose, her mind piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. What do you think, Miss Marple? The deputy asked, his voice uncertain. Miss Marple gave a small smile, her eyes distant as she thought. I think Enoch knows more than he's letting on. But I also think he's afraid of something or someone. He may have seen the man at the lighthouse, but I suspect there's a far deeper connection than he's telling us. The question is why he's lying, and what he's protecting. The deputy nodded, though it was clear that he wasn't quite convinced. You think he's involved? No, I don't, Miss Marple said, her voice calm. But I do think he's been caught up in something much larger than he realizes. The coat he mentioned, too fine, too new, is a crucial detail. Fishermen don't wear coats like that. It was the coat of someone with money, with power, someone with a purpose. Whoever killed the man at the lighthouse, they wanted to make a statement. The deputy's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent as they continued walking back toward the village. When they arrived at the Fisherman's Arms, Miss Marple found the sheriff still deep in conversation with his deputies. The air in the inn was thick with tension, the kind that came with uncertainty, and Miss Marple knew that the full weight of the crime hadn't yet been understood. The pieces were there, but the puzzle remained incomplete. Miss Marple approached the sheriff, her expression thoughtful. Sheriff, I believe we need to speak with some of the others who were in the area that night. I suspect the killer is closer than we think. The sheriff glanced up, his eyes weary. "I'm listening, Miss Marple. But there's something strange about all of this. We keep turning over the same stones and there's nothing to show for it." "Perhaps, Miss Marple," replied, her eyes sharp, "but sometimes the truth is hidden in the smallest of details. You just have to know where to look." And as the storm raged outside, Miss Marple felt certain that the answers were beginning to fall into place. The voices of deception were speaking louder now, and soon enough, she would hear their true story. The following days saw the storm abate, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed the world itself had been suspended in time. But for Miss Marple, time was something she never let slip. With the clues she had gathered, the puzzle was no longer just a few scattered pieces. It was becoming a clearer image, though not without complications. In the dimly lit room of the Fisherman's Arms, Miss Marple sat with the sheriff and his deputies, each man's face tense with uncertainty. They had spent the better part of the morning reviewing the evidence and re-interviewing the same witnesses, but nothing about the case seemed to fit together. The sheriff leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "We've got no shortage of suspects, Miss Marple, but every single one has an alibi. The man who died, well, he wasn't well liked, but no one seems to have a solid reason to kill him. Not one that fits, anyway." Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression calm, almost serene. "Is that so? It's true that each person may appear to have an alibi, but alibis are often like coats in a storm. They hide more than they reveal." She took a slow breath and leaned back in her chair, letting her words settle. "But alibis are just the start, Sheriff. What we need to focus on is the motive, the why behind the crime." The sheriff's deputy, who had grown increasingly unsettled as the investigation unfolded, shifted nervously. "I've been going over everything we know about the victim. His name was Thomas Webb, a fisherman by trade, but he wasn't like the others around here. Lived alone, didn't mingle much with the locals." "Thomas Webb," Miss Marple repeated, her mind tracing the lines of his life. "Fisherman or not, he must have had some connection to this village, some reason to be here. The question is whether his death was personal or whether it was the product of something larger, a web of connections leading to more than one person." The deputy opened a notebook, scanning through the pages. "We've spoken to the dock workers, the few folks who saw him last. Some said he was on edge in the days before his death. Others claim he was looking for something, someone. But nothing solid, nothing to tie it all together. We also learned that he had some dealings with a merchant from the city, but nothing concrete. No one knows what it was about." Miss Marple's eyes glinted with curiosity. "A merchant, you say? Now that's a thread worth pulling. Could it be that Mr. Webb was in debt, or perhaps seeking something from this merchant, something that led to his death?" "I wouldn't rule it out," the sheriff replied, his voice grim, "but we can't be certain yet. The merchant, a man by the name of Charles Grayson, left the village days ago. Claims he was just here on business." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "Business. It always seems to come down to business, doesn't it?" The investigation into Grayson had yielded little so far. He was well known in the area as a shrewd businessman with a reputation for getting what he wanted. But there was no evidence linking him to Webb's death. Yet Miss Marple felt there was more to this story, something just out of reach. Then there was the matter of Enoch, the fisherman who had witnessed the man leaving the lighthouse. He had been so insistent about the coat, a coat too fine for a local, a new coat, one that wasn't a fisherman's. That had caught Miss Marple's attention, particularly when she thought about the unusual nature of Webb's last days. Had the coat been left behind as a clue? Or was it simply another red herring designed to mislead? There were others to consider. Jenna, Webb's estranged wife, who had returned to the village only a week before the murder. She claimed to be here for personal reasons, but her sudden reappearance raised questions. Then there was Marcus Kane, the local tavern owner, who had known Webb for years and had seemed unusually eager to speak to the authorities. Miss Marple had learned from a reliable source that Marcus and Thomas had once been close friends, but their relationship had soured years ago under mysterious circumstances. Could old grudges have resurfaced? Each of these people had motives, but none of their stories seemed to explain everything. Greed, revenge, jealousy. Each of these emotions had a hand to play in the drama unfolding. But the true motive remained elusive. Miss Marple needed to understand not just the players in this tangled web, but the threads that connected them. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Jenna Webb's cottage. It was an unassuming house, nestled on the edge of the village, its windows covered with thick curtains, as if the darkness outside had been invited in. Jenna opened the door with a weary smile, her face showing signs of stress, but her eyes wary as if she was ready for something, perhaps an accusation. "I didn't expect anyone to come calling today," Jenna said, her voice tight. "I've already spoken with the sheriff, Miss Marple. I don't know what else there is to say." "Forgive me, Mrs. Webb, for intruding," Miss Marple replied softly, "but there are still many pieces to this puzzle. Perhaps you can help me make sense of a few of them." Jenna hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside to allow Miss Marple in. The interior of the cottage was sparsely furnished, with an almost oppressive air of abandonment. A single picture of Thomas Webb sat on the mantel, his face frozen in a moment of quiet contemplation. Miss Marple took a seat in one of the worn armchairs. "You and Thomas were estranged, I understand," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but probing. Jenna's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly together. "We had our differences," she said, her voice betraying a hint of bitterness. "He was a stubborn man, never listened to reason. But I never wished him harm. I hadn't seen him in years until he sent for me. He wanted to speak about something important, but he was so closed off, so distant. And then—" She trailed off, her eyes shadowed with sorrow. "You didn't meet with him?" Miss Marple asked, her tone softening. "No," Jenna replied quickly. "He was supposed to meet me at the old docks, but something came up. I don't know what it was. When I arrived, he wasn't there. I went to the Lighthouse looking for him, but he wasn't there either. That's when I found out." Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was something in her eyes. A flicker of guilt, perhaps, but also fear. Did Thomas ever speak of a merchant? Charles Grayson, perhaps? Or anything that might explain his increasing unease in the days before his death? Jenna's face hardened at the mention of Grayson. "Grayson," she muttered. "That man. He came to Thomas about business. But he was more than that. Grayson was involved in something Thomas wouldn't tell me about. I know he was keeping secrets, but I never got the chance to know them." Miss Marple's mind raced. A merchant, a hidden agenda, a wife left out of the loop. What did all of this point to? One thing was clear. The motives were there, but the picture was still fractured. As she stood to leave, she gave Jenna a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Webb. I'll be in touch soon. There are still many things we need to uncover. The pieces are falling into place, but we're not quite there yet." As Miss Marple stepped outside, she felt the weight of the mystery settling more heavily on her shoulders. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear. The motives were like threads in a tangled knot. But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Someone was hiding something. And in time, those secrets would unravel. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversation with Jenna Webb were filled with a new sense of urgency. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and half-formed, were starting to align. The merchant Charles Grayson, though seemingly a distant figure in the case, had begun to look more and more like a man with something to hide. Miss Marple, ever patient and methodical, knew she had to keep digging. But as fate would have it, the breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. It was a chilly morning when the sheriff's office called. The deputy's voice on the other end was terse, hurried. "Miss Marple, you might want to come down to the station. We found something that could crack this case wide open." Within minutes, Miss Marple was on her way to the station, her thoughts churning. What? Could it be a new lead, a hidden clue? The possibilities were endless, and yet she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the answers were closer than anyone realized. When she arrived at the sheriff's office, she found the room buzzing with activity. The sheriff stood near the bulletin board, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, we've got it. This is the break we've been waiting for." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but she allowed herself to approach the sheriff. "What have you found?" The sheriff held up a scrap of paper, a piece torn from a ledger, and Miss Marple could see at once that it was stained with ink and age, the handwriting scrawled and frantic. It was found in the pocket of one of the coats at the scene of the murder. Someone must have missed it before, but it's clear now. It's a record of transactions. Business dealings between Thomas Webb and a man named Grayson. She studied the paper carefully. It was indeed a list of transactions, sums of money, dates, and cryptic references to goods being exchanged. There was one phrase repeated several times that stood out. "The shipment arrives at midnight." Looks like Webb was involved in something illicit, the sheriff continued, clearly pleased. Grayson must have been using him as a go-between for something shady, smuggling maybe. And when Webb tried to back out, Grayson must have killed him to keep the secret quiet. Miss Marple let the sheriff's words hang in the air, considering them carefully. The evidence was damning, there was no doubt about that. The transaction records pointed directly to Grayson, and his departure from the village seemed more like an escape than a mere business trip. The pieces were all falling into place, but the detective in Miss Marple couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was still wrong. "This is quite an interesting find," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm and measured. "But it doesn't tell us everything. Why would Thomas Webb, a man with a reputation as a fisherman, suddenly involve himself in something like this? And why would he keep it secret from everyone, including his wife? It doesn't add up." The sheriff's smile faded slightly. Perhaps he was trying to protect his family. Perhaps Grayson was threatening him. Who knows what kind of pressure he was under? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "I don't disagree with you, Sheriff. But I feel there is more to this than we're seeing. Webb may have been involved with Grayson, but this doesn't explain why Webb was so anxious in the days before his death, nor why he didn't tell anyone about his dealings. If there was something to hide, it would have been more than just business. There's a personal element here we're missing." The sheriff frowned, clearly frustrated. I don't understand, Miss Marple. This piece of evidence could be the key to solving the whole thing. I know, Miss Marple replied, her eyes thoughtful. But sometimes the most important piece of evidence isn't the one that fits the most neatly into the story. Sometimes it's the one that everyone overlooks. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'll need to speak to Grayson again, she said finally. There's something about him I don't trust. The sheriff hesitated but nodded. If you think it'll help, but we're pretty certain we've got our man. Miss Marple turned away, her mind already whirring with the possibilities. The evidence against Grayson seemed conclusive, but a small voice inside her insisted that the case was not yet solved. There was something about the entire situation, the haste with which everyone had latched onto this new evidence, that seemed too convenient. As she left the sheriff's office, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel that the real criminal was still out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. That afternoon, she made her way to the merchant's shop, the place where Grayson had been seen frequently before his sudden departure. The shop was tucked away at the edge of the village, and as she walked toward it, Miss Marple could feel the tension mounting. She had no doubt that Grayson had a hand in the events that had led to Webb's death, but the real question was how deep the merchant's involvement went, and more importantly, why he had left so quickly. The bell above the door rang as Miss Marple entered the shop, and Grayson looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. Miss Marple, he said, his voice smooth but guarded, I didn't expect to see you here. Have you come to finish your questions? I've come to ask a few more, Miss Marple replied, her tone polite but firm. I'd like to hear your side of things, Mr. Grayson. I believe we have unfinished business. Grayson didn't flinch, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of wariness that Miss Marple recognized all too well. I've already told the authorities everything I know, he said, his voice calm but clipped. I'm sure you have, Miss Marple said, but I don't think you've told the whole truth. Grayson gave a short laugh, the sound sharp and mirthless. And what makes you say that? Miss Marple stepped closer to the counter, her eyes fixed on him. Because there's something in your story that doesn't make sense. You say you were just here on business, but no one has been able to verify the nature of that business. You left the village in a hurry without any clear explanation, and you were the last person to have seen Thomas Webb alive. Grayson's smile faltered, but only for a moment. That's just a coincidence, he said quickly, his voice tight. I have nothing to do with his death. The transactions you've found, well, those were just business, nothing more. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the ledger behind the counter, where the same cryptic notes she had seen at the sheriff's office were written. You've been very careful, Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice soft. Too careful. But sometimes, when people try to hide the truth, they make one mistake. And that mistake is usually the thing that reveals everything. Grayson's expression hardened, and for a brief moment Miss Marple could see the faintest flicker of panic in his eyes. But he quickly masked it with a smile. Well, Miss Marple, I'm afraid you've reached the wrong conclusion. There's nothing more to this story than what you've already uncovered. Miss Marple regarded him silently for a moment, her mind racing with the implications of his words. The case seemed to be on the verge of resolution, but something didn't sit right. The evidence, though damning, was too perfect. It felt as though someone had carefully orchestrated it to look like a clear-cut case. And as Miss Marple left the shop, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a trap. A false victory had been handed to the authorities, But she knew deep down that the true criminal was still out there, watching, waiting. The game wasn't over yet. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversation with Grayson left her restless. Though she couldn't put her finger on it, something about his demeanor bothered her more than she cared to admit. His swift dismissal of her questions had been far too practiced, too confident. And while the evidence seemed to point squarely at him, there was still an underlying sense of something missing. It wasn't until the following evening, when Miss Marple was sitting alone in her modest cottage, sipping tea and reflecting on the details of the case, that the breakthrough she'd been waiting for finally came. It wasn't the startling discovery of a new piece of evidence, nor an interview that shed new light on the mystery. It came in the form of an old newspaper clipping. The clipping had been tucked away in a file she kept for cases of interest, a file she hadn't bothered with in years. As she sipped her tea, her fingers had absent-mindedly brushed against the edge of the file, and the old newspaper fell out. It was a report from several decades ago, detailing a string of disappearances that had plagued the village of Blackwater Bay when Thomas Webb was a young man. The missing persons were all fishermen, all men with connections to the docks, and the disappearances had been unsolved. The authorities had been baffled, and the case had gone cold. But the striking detail was the pattern. Each disappearance seemed to coincide with a large shipment of goods arriving at the docks. Goods that were never properly accounted for. As Miss Marple stared at the yellowed page, a chilling thought began to take shape in her mind. Could it be that Webb had been involved in something far darker than anyone had realized? Was it possible that the old disappearances were connected to his death? The connection was faint, almost intangible, but Miss Marple trusted her instincts. She had always believed that crimes didn't exist in isolation. They had histories, they had roots, and sometimes the most crucial information was buried deep in the past, forgotten until the time was right for it to surface again. The more she thought about it, the more the threads seemed to weave together. The sudden appearance of Jenna Webb in the village, the mysterious transactions with Grayson, and now this, an old case of disappearances linked to the very docks where Thomas Webb had worked. It was a pattern that no one had connected, not even the sheriff. But Miss Marple could feel the truth lurking just beneath the surface. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the local archives where the records of the old disappearances were stored. She spent hours combing through the files, piecing together names and dates, cross-referencing details. It was there, in a forgotten corner of the records, that she discovered another startling connection. The names of two men who had disappeared over 20 years ago, both of whom had been in business with a young Thomas Webb. The men had been close to Webb, and one of them had even been seen arguing with him just days before his disappearance. The realization hit Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just Grayson who had been involved in this web of deceit. It was something far older, something that had begun years before anyone had even considered the possibility of a murder. The disappearances were not random. They were part of a larger scheme, one that had begun decades ago and had only now come to light. Webb's involvement in that scheme, his ties to these missing men, had been buried in the shadows for years. But now, it was all coming to a head. As she left the archive, her thoughts whirling, Miss Marple's resolve grew. The current case was no longer just about a businessman gone rogue, no longer just about a simple murder. It was about a network of deceit, about a past that had never been fully understood, and about the fact that there were people who had spent years covering their tracks. The game had changed. The suspects were no longer just those with the most obvious motives. They were those with the most to lose. That afternoon, Miss Marple met with the sheriff and his deputies, her mind clear with the knowledge that this case had roots much deeper than anyone had realized. She began to lay out the connections she had uncovered, pointing out the ties between the disappearances, Webb's involvement, and the recent developments with Grayson. The sheriff listened intently, his brow furrowed as he took in the details. "You're saying this all ties together somehow?" the sheriff asked, his voice low. "That the disappearances all those years ago are connected to Webb's death?" Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. There's a thread running through all of this, Sheriff, and I believe it's been there all along. Thomas Webb's involvement in those disappearances was never fully understood, but now I think it's clear. He was part of something much larger than any of us realized." The sheriff sat back, clearly processing the weight of Miss Marple's words. "But what does that mean for the case? If Grayson's not the real culprit?" "Grayson is part of the puzzle," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "but not the whole picture. I believe the truth lies somewhere between the old disappearances and the current murder. Someone is protecting a very dark secret, and Thomas Webb was the key to it all. He knew something that led to his death." The sheriff looked down at his hands, a sigh escaping his lips. But who would have known to cover their tracks for so long? These disappearances, they were forgotten years ago. "Not forgotten," Miss Marple corrected him. "They were buried, hidden, and now they've resurfaced because someone has finally connected the dots." As the days passed, Miss Marple's investigation shifted focus. She no longer concentrated on Grayson alone, but instead began to consider the relationships Webb had maintained throughout his life. There were whispers of a shadowy figure, a former business partner, someone with no direct ties to the village, but whose influence had been felt far beyond. It seemed that this figure had connections to not just Webb, but to the missing fishermen of the past as well. Someone who had a vested interest in keeping those disappearances quiet, someone who had ensured that the authorities never dug too deep. It wasn't until Miss Marple revisited the lighthouse, examining it with a fresh perspective, that the final piece of the puzzle came into place. She noticed a hidden trapdoor beneath the old stairs, a small, almost invisible opening that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. Beneath it lay a set of rusted crates covered in dust and cobwebs, as though they hadn't been touched in years. Inside the crates, Miss Marple found something that confirmed her suspicions: old ledgers dated back to the time of the disappearances, filled with cryptic references to deliveries and goods. These weren't business transactions. They were records of something far darker, something that tied the disappearances directly to the criminal activities Webb had once been involved in. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the crumbling pages. She knew now that the case was no longer just about a murder. It was about a tangled web of corruption, lies, and secrets that stretched back decades. The murder of Thomas Webb had been the spark that reignited a fire that had been smoldering for years, and as the investigation deepened, Miss Marple understood that the true criminal was not just trying to hide a murder. He was trying to erase a history that had already begun to unravel. The past was no longer buried, and with it, the shadows that had loomed over the village for so long were finally beginning to fall into the light. The discovery of the hidden crate in the lighthouse was a pivotal moment for Miss Marple. She had learned more about Thomas Webb's tangled past in those dusty, forgotten ledgers than any of the authorities had in years. The truth was starting to come into sharp focus, but it wasn't enough. She needed a break, a reaction from someone involved, something that would tip the balance and push the investigation over the edge. Grayson was still at the top of her list of suspects. His story was too tidy, too rehearsed. He had always maintained his innocence, but Miss Marple had a keen sense for reading people, and something in his eyes, the brief flicker of uncertainty, the way he deflected her questions, told her that he was hiding something. He had been far too comfortable with the narrative that had been presented to the sheriff's office. He had agreed to everything too easily. It was as if he expected the authorities to follow a certain line, and they had. The detective knew that when people felt cornered, they often showed their true colors. But the question was how to create that sense of pressure without pushing them too far. She needed to find a way to make Grayson react unexpectedly, something that would expose the crack in his armor. It wasn't until she was alone in her cottage late one evening that the idea came to her. A tactic she had used before, one she had learned long ago from watching the way people behaved when they thought they were in control. It wasn't about brute force or even logic. It was about creating a situation where the suspect would feel an involuntary urge to prove themselves, a subtle nudge, just enough to unnerve them. The next day, Miss Marple put her plan into action. She didn't go to the sheriff or any of the deputies. Instead, she made a solitary visit to Grayson's shop. The air was cool with the approach of autumn, and the village was quieter than usual, as though it too was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. When she arrived, Grayson looked up from his counter, his gaze sharp as ever. "Miss Marple." He greeted her smoothly, as though he had been expecting her. "What can I do for you today?" "I've been thinking," Miss Marple began, her voice calm and measured, "about the evidence we found, and about the things you told the authorities. I realize now that there's something I missed, something important. You see, I've been doing a bit more digging, and it seems that the whole story about the smuggling operation doesn't quite add up." Grayson raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. Miss Marple continued, making her tone casual, almost disinterested. "It's strange, isn't it? The timing of everything, Webb's sudden involvement with you, the way the shipments came and went. I'm not sure I believe the whole story. In fact, I wonder if the authorities would be so eager to jump to conclusions if they had known more about your dealings with Webb. There's a lot we haven't discussed after all." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I wonder if there's something else, something hidden." Grayson stiffened slightly, but again he said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she added softly, "You know, I'm sure I could find more about those old smuggling operations, about the men who disappeared. It's funny, the things that turn up when you dig deep enough. People in the village, they love to talk, they remember things, and sometimes that's all it takes." She let the words fall heavy between them, watching Grayson carefully. His expression was unreadable, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor. His hand twitched almost imperceptibly, and for just a fraction of a second she saw the tension in his shoulders. It was the smallest of gestures, but Miss Marple had seen it before in others. It was the instinctive reaction of a man who knew something was coming, but didn't yet know how to counter it. "I'm sure everything you've told us is above board," Miss Marple continued, keeping her voice light and conversational. "But perhaps just to be safe, we should take another look at the records, don't you think? After all, I wouldn't want to miss anything. There's so much history in this village, and you never know what little detail could come to light." Grayson's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing together into a thin line. Miss Marple's subtle suggestion had clearly made him uncomfortable. He was a man who prided himself on control, and this gentle push had thrown him off balance. He was no longer the picture of composure he had once appeared to be. "You're wasting your time, Miss Marple," Grayson said at last, his voice slightly sharper than before. "I've already told you everything you need to know. The authorities have everything they need. There's nothing more to this." But Miss Marple could sense the tremor in his words, the crack in his calm facade. It was the sound of a man who was starting to realize that his perfectly spun web of lies was beginning to unravel. And that was precisely what Miss Marple had been waiting for. She smiled to herself as she turned to leave. "Oh, of course, but you know how it is. Sometimes the smallest detail can change everything." Grayson didn't respond, but she could feel his eyes on her as she stepped out of the shop. The atmosphere around her had changed, the air thick with the unspoken tension of an encounter that had gone off script. She had done it. She had planted the seed of doubt in his mind, and now she just needed to wait. That night, Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table going over her notes once more. The pieces were falling into place. She had no doubt now that Grayson had been involved in something far deeper than he had let on. But it wasn't just about the smuggling, or even the murder. The truth lay hidden in the connections between the past and the present, between the men who had disappeared and the lies that had been buried with them. The following morning, the sheriff arrived at her cottage, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've had another development. Grayson's been seen acting suspiciously near the docks. He's trying to leave the village, and the word is that he's making plans to skip town. I think you were right. He's hiding something." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "He's not the only one," she said softly. "There's more to this story than just Grayson. The past has a way of catching up with people, Sheriff. And I think it's time we uncovered the truth once and for all." The sheriff nodded, and Miss Marple's heart raced with anticipation. The cracks in Grayson's facade were wide enough now for the truth to pour through, and she was ready to follow wherever it led. Morning after the sheriff had confirmed Grayson's suspicious behavior, Miss Marple felt the tension in the air, thicker than ever. The case was finally gaining the momentum it needed, but as she sat at her kitchen table, her mind racing through the new developments, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sheriff had promised to keep a close eye on Grayson, and Miss Marple was sure that the man was going to make a move soon, whether to flee or to destroy whatever he thought might be a threat. But Miss Marple had never been one to sit idly by and wait for things to unfold. She had learned long ago that in matters of deception, timing was everything. She knew that the next step had to be carefully calculated. Grayson was too aware of her presence now, too cautious. She needed to catch him off guard, to give him the illusion of control so that he would slip up and reveal his hand. It wasn't until late afternoon, as Miss Marple was preparing for her next visit to the sheriff's office, that the first real sign of sabotage appeared. The sheriff had asked her to bring along the collection of evidence she had painstakingly gathered. Those ledgers from the Lighthouse, the old newspaper clippings, and the records that tied Grayson to the disappearances of the past. These were the pieces that connected the dots between the present and the past. She had planned to show them to the sheriff to solidify her suspicions, to present them as the foundation for an official search warrant. But when Miss Marple opened her satchel to retrieve the evidence, she found it empty. The file with the crucial records, the one she had only just reviewed the night before, was gone. Her first thought was that she had mislaid it. Perhaps in her hurried preparations, she had left it in another room or dropped it somewhere in the house. But as she searched every corner of her cottage, checking once more and then again, the sinking feeling grew deeper. It wasn't just misplaced, it had been taken. Someone had entered her home and stolen it right out from under her nose. The realization hit her with a force she wasn't prepared for. This was no random act. Someone knew exactly what was inside the file and had taken it to ensure it never saw the light of day. The stakes had just risen, and Miss Marple knew now that the case was not only about finding the truth, it was about stopping someone from burying it for good. She wasted no time in informing the sheriff. The urgency in her voice was enough to have him meeting her at her cottage within minutes. Together, they scoured every inch of the house, checking windows, locks, and even the chimney. But there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had taken the file had done so with careful precision, leaving no trace behind. "It's like they knew exactly where to look," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. "Someone knew what was in that file, and they're trying to erase the evidence before we can make our move." The sheriff, a practical man, frowned deeply. "I'll put the word out, Miss Marple. We'll search the village, question anyone who might have seen something. But if it was Grayson, he's already too far ahead of us." Miss Marple shook her head. "It's not just about Grayson. Whoever took the evidence is more than just an accomplice. They're trying to stop us from uncovering the whole truth." The next few days were filled with heightened tension. Grayson's movements became even more erratic, but Miss Marple knew that he was playing a dangerous game now. He wasn't just running from the law, he was fighting for his freedom, and he would do anything to keep his secret safe. But there was more at stake than just Grayson now. Miss Marple could feel it, like a heavy shadow hanging over the village. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone whose motives went far deeper than a simple cover-up. Then, just as Miss Marple was beginning to piece together a new theory, one that involved not only Grayson, but the mysterious disappearance of the fisherman decades ago, another twist occurred. The sheriff arrived at her cottage late one evening, his face grim. "We found the file," he said, his voice low. "But it's not what you expected." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "Where was it? Who found it?" "In the river," the sheriff explained. "Someone tried to destroy it. Most of the pages were waterlogged, unreadable, but we managed to salvage a few. It's clear someone didn't want this information getting out." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected that someone was working against her, but now the evidence was undeniable. Whoever was involved in this crime, whether it was Grayson or someone more deeply hidden in the shadows, was not only trying to hide the truth, but they were willing to go to any lengths to ensure that it stayed buried. The sheriff handed her the salvaged pages, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned them carefully. The water had rendered much of the text illegible, but a few key phrases still stood out. There was a mention of transactions and deliveries, and then, just as the page began to blur into ink stains, there was one word she could still read clearly. "Webb. Webb," she whispered to herself. "It always comes back to him." The sheriff's face twisted with frustration. "What now, Miss Marple? We're losing ground. The evidence is gone, the leads are fading, and Grayson's nowhere to be found." "I'm not so sure about that," Miss Marple replied, her mind racing. "There's still one thing we haven't considered fully. Whoever is behind this, whoever is going to such great lengths to erase all the evidence is someone who has something to lose, something far more valuable than just a business deal. This isn't just about Webb. It's about the legacy of something much darker. She paused, staring at the few surviving fragments of the file. We've only scratched the surface, Sheriff, and I believe we've just learned who is willing to go to these lengths to keep the truth from being uncovered. Her thoughts whirred as she pieced the puzzle together. Someone had come to great lengths to destroy the evidence, to stop her from getting closer to the truth. And now, Miss Marple knew what she had to do. It was time to turn the tables. The bomb case was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was about confronting the person who was willing to erase it. And Miss Marple would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The village was cloaked in a false sense of calm, as though the dark clouds that had gathered over it in the past weeks had finally begun to dissipate. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, something was brewing. It wasn't just Grayson anymore. There was someone else, someone with far more control, far more determination to keep the past buried. She had spent the last few days retracing her steps, rethinking every conversation, every small detail she had overlooked in the frenzy of the investigation. She hadn't expected the case to take such a personal turn, but now it was clear that whoever was behind the destruction of the evidence wasn't content to just silence the truth. No, they were willing to go much further, to strike fear into those who got too close. The evening air was cool when Miss Marple left her cottage for a quiet walk, needing to clear her mind. The village was still, the only sounds coming from the distant murmur of the sea and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But just as she rounded a bend near the docks, she heard a sharp cry, a voice she recognized immediately. "Miss Marple, help!" The cry was followed by the sound of hurried footsteps, someone stumbling in the dark. She turned toward the noise just in time to see Grayson, pale and breathless, rush toward her. His usually composed face was now contorted with panic, his eyes wide with fear. "Grayson," she asked, her heart racing. "What is it? What's happened?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip ironclad and desperate. They've taken her, Miss Marple. They've taken Eleanor." The name struck Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. Eleanor, Grayson's wife, had always seemed a quiet, unassuming woman, content to stay out of the limelight, but she had been an important figure in this tangled web of lies and deceit. Miss Marple had only spoken with her briefly during her visits, but something in the way Eleanor carried herself had always seemed distant, as though she knew more than she let on. "Taken her," Miss Marple repeated, trying to steady herself. Who took her?" Grayson's face was pale, his voice trembling. "I don't know. I was at the inn, and when I returned, the house was empty. The door was wide open. There was blood on the floor, Miss Marple. Blood. I think they've killed her." The words hit her like a cold wave. This was no longer just about Grayson or the smuggling operation. Someone had just escalated things to a new level. Eleanor was the victim, but Miss Marple knew that this new crime was not simply an act of violence. It was a message, a warning. "I need to see the house," Miss Marple said firmly, her mind already working through the possibilities. There was a moment of hesitation in Grayson's eyes, but he quickly nodded and led her back down the winding path toward his home. By the time they reached the house, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The front door was indeed ajar, and the faint smell of iron hung in the air, mingling with the salty scent of the sea. Inside, The scene was even worse than she had imagined. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and left open, papers scattered across the floor. And there, in the center of it all, was the blood. A trail of it led from the door to the small study at the back of the house. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room carefully. The blood was not as abundant as she would have expected in a violent struggle, but it was enough to confirm Grayson's fears. The real question, however, was not about the blood. It was about the absence of Eleanor. "Where is she, Grayson?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her voice calm but firm. "Did you search the house thoroughly? Is there any sign of her?" He nodded, his face a mask of desperation. "I've checked every room. She's gone. Whoever took her, whoever did this, they've left no trace. There's nothing to follow." Miss Marple frowned as she looked around the room. The house had been ransacked, but it didn't make sense. If the kidnappers had been looking for something, why would they leave without taking anything of value? Nothing seemed to fit. And then something caught her eye. On the edge of the desk was a small, delicate piece of paper. It was not torn or wrinkled like the other papers that had been tossed about, but pristine, almost deliberately left untouched. Miss Marple approached the desk carefully, her fingers grazing the edge of the paper. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the hastily written message. "The game is still on, Miss Marple. There's more to lose now. You've been warned." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the note. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Someone was playing a game with her, and they weren't finished yet. Grayson, his voice breaking, stepped closer. "What does it mean? Who would do this? What do they want from us?" Miss Marple glanced at him, her mind already working through the implications. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a carefully orchestrated move, meant to derail her investigation, to stop her from finding out the truth. The murder of Eleanor, if that was indeed what had happened, was a message, not just to Grayson, but to Miss Marple herself. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to ensure their secrets remained hidden. "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "the game is only just beginning." Her words hung in the air as she turned back to the blood-stained trail leading deeper into the house. The stakes had just gotten much higher. And now, it wasn't just about uncovering a buried past. It was about saving lives, including her own. Whoever was behind this had just made it personal. And Miss Marple would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. The hours following the discovery of Eleanor's disappearance, and the chilling note that had been left behind, passed in a blur. Grayson had been beside himself, pacing back and forth, unable to comprehend how his wife could have been taken without a trace. The sheriff had arrived shortly after Miss Marple, and together they had scoured the house for any clues that might shed light on who was responsible for this terrifying turn of events. But every search led to more questions than answers. Nothing fit together. Nothing made sense. As the night wore on and the sheriff began organizing a more formal search party, Miss Marple sat in a quiet corner of the room, her mind spinning through the fragments of information they had gathered. Eleanor's disappearance was no accident. This was deliberate. It wasn't just a kidnapping for ransom. No, this was something much deeper. A message meant to unsettle, to confuse. And yet, amid all the chaos, there was something oddly familiar about the whole situation. A subtle detail, almost imperceptible at first, began to surface in her mind. A detail that had slipped under the radar until now, something that, if she was right, could tie everything together. She had to see it more clearly, pull it into focus. Miss Marple excused herself from the scene, stepping out into the cool night air. Her thoughts clouded but sharper now. The quiet streets of the village seemed deceptively peaceful, the same old world carrying on as though nothing had changed. But Miss Marple knew that the calm was merely the calm before a storm. Her mind drifted back to one of the first things she had noticed in this investigation: the odd behavior of the townspeople. There had been whispers, hushed conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room, strange reactions from the most unlikely sources. Grayson had been a focus naturally, but now it seemed that others were involved too. There were connections she hadn't fully explored yet, and she knew that to make sense of this crime, she had to find the thread that tied it all together. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she retraced her steps in her mind. The past few weeks had been filled with too many small, seemingly disconnected moments, details that, at the time, hadn't seemed important enough to investigate. But now she realized those tiny fragments were the key. One of the most curious instances had been a brief conversation she'd had with the village postmaster, a man by the name of Albert Webb. He'd been nervous during their interaction, his responses too quick, too rehearsed, as if he were trying too hard to appear uninvolved. At the time, she'd chalked it up to nothing more than the usual small-town paranoia, but now it seemed far more significant. Webb had been too eager to provide her with information, too insistent that he had nothing to hide. Then there was the peculiar incident involving the lighthouse keeper. When Miss Marple had visited him earlier, the man had been unusually agitated, even though he'd offered her little in terms of useful information. He'd mentioned his duties in a passing, almost offhand way, and he'd seemed strangely distracted, as if there was something on his mind that he wasn't willing to share. It was these oddities, these subtle moments, that Miss Marple kept returning to. They were the pieces of a puzzle that, when looked at from a different angle, began to form a picture. A pattern that had always been there, just out of reach. As she walked through the quiet village streets, something clicked in her mind. The pattern was not random, it was intentional, a design meant to obscure the truth. All these different people, these seemingly unrelated figures, were connected in ways she hadn't yet understood. It wasn't just the disappearance of Eleanor, it was about control, about maintaining the status quo at all costs. Miss Marple stopped at the edge of the village, her eyes scanning the landscape. The lighthouse stood stark against the darkening sky, its light flashing rhythmically. She had visited there once, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the lighthouse wasn't just a backdrop to this mystery. It was central to it. There was something about it, something she hadn't been able to see before, that tied everything together. But before she could walk further toward the lighthouse, a familiar voice called out from behind her. "Miss Marple, I thought I'd find you here." She turned to see the sheriff approaching, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his expression one of resolve. "I've just spoken with the villagers. There's talk of strange goings-on at the lighthouse. Recently. Something's been off there for months, but no one seems willing to talk about it." Miss Marple considered this. "Strange goings-on," she repeated, a spark of realization flickering in her mind. The sheriff nodded, his gaze cautious. "No one's sure what's been happening, but there've been rumors. People disappearing, odd noises at night, lights flickering when there shouldn't be." The lighthouse has always been a place of isolation, but now it seems different. How different? Miss Marple asked, her curiosity piqued. He sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. People are afraid to go near it. A few folks even claim that they've seen someone coming and going at odd hours, someone they don't recognize. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing the information together. She had visited the lighthouse on a whim early in her investigation, and at the time it had seemed like little more than a scenic curiosity. But now, knowing what she did, she realized the lighthouse was more than just an isolated location. It was a focal point. A hub where secrets were hidden, where connections were made, and she had overlooked it, as if it had been hiding in plain sight. "I think we need to go to the lighthouse," Miss Marple said, her voice firm with conviction. "Now?" The sheriff nodded, and the two of them set off in the direction of the lighthouse. As they walked, Miss Marple could feel the pieces finally falling into place. She had known that there was something bigger at play here, something that stretched back much further than Grayson and his wife. But now, she saw that the missing link wasn't just a piece of the past, it was right in front of them, staring them in the face. The lighthouse held the key, and Miss Marple had no intention of leaving until she found the answers she sought. The night air grew colder as Miss Marple and the sheriff made their way toward the lighthouse. The beam of the lantern in the sheriff's hand cast long shadows on the uneven ground, and the rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the shore provided an eerie backdrop to their journey. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled, and though she had a growing sense that they were on the brink of uncovering something monumental, she knew better than to jump to conclusions. The thread she had uncovered needed to be unraveled slowly, piece by piece. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a tall, solitary figure against the vast expanse of the darkening sky. The closer they drew to it, the more Miss Marple felt a strange tension in the air, an unspoken weight that seemed to hang over everything. This was no ordinary investigation. There was something personal, something visceral about this case that transcended the simple elements of crime and motive. Something that connected the past with the present, in ways Miss Marple had not yet fully grasped. As they reached the base of the lighthouse, the sheriff looked up at the towering structure, his brow furrowing. "This place has always felt unsettling," he said softly, almost to himself. "But there's something about it tonight. It's as if it's holding its breath." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "We've been led here for a reason," she murmured. "Let's see if we can't uncover what it is." They made their way up the narrow, winding staircase inside the lighthouse, the faint creaking of the old wooden steps adding to the sense of tension. As they reached the top, the view of the stormy sea below was stunning, yet haunting in its isolation. But Miss Marple wasn't interested in the view. She was interested in what lay beyond it. There was a door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar. A quiet, hissing noise emanated from the small crack in the door, like the sound of someone holding their breath. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the sheriff before carefully pushing the door open. What they found inside was a room unlike any Miss Marple had expected. It was far too neat and well-maintained for a lighthouse that had been supposedly abandoned. The walls were lined with maps and documents, some of them old and yellowed, others fresh and meticulously arranged. A large desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers that at first glance seemed like mere records of lighthouse operations. But something about the neatness of it all, the precision with which everything was laid out, struck her as off. Her gaze swept over the desk until something caught her eye. A small, inconspicuous journal hidden beneath a pile of old maps. Without a word, she approached the desk and carefully picked it up, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, controlled, and deliberate. But the content of the journal sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't a log of daily operations. As one might have expected, no, this was a chronicle of secrets, of quiet manipulations and long-buried guilt. And the name that appeared again and again in the journal made Miss Marple's breath catch in her throat. It was Grayson. The connections she had been piecing, together the threads that had felt scattered and vague, now began to weave themselves into a terrifying tapestry. Grayson had been involved far more deeply in the events leading up to Eleanor's disappearance than she had realized. But it wasn't just his affair with the mysterious woman that had brought them here. It was the deeper, darker secrets he had hidden for years. Miss Marple could feel her mind racing as she processed the implications of the journal. The sheriff stood quietly beside her, waiting for her to speak, but Miss Marple was lost in the gravity of the discovery. Her fingers traced the inked words on the pages, and as she read, a pattern began to emerge, one that wasn't just about greed or revenge. This was something far more psychological, rooted in something deeper than a mere crime. It was about obsession. The journal spoke of a dangerous relationship between Grayson and the lighthouse keeper, who, it now seemed, had been far more than a simple caretaker. The keeper's name, Thomas, appeared frequently alongside Grayson's in the cryptic entries. What Miss Marple had initially taken for casual associations now appeared to be the center of a twisted and obsessive bond. Grayson, who had always felt untouchable due to his wealth and status, had found a kindred spirit in Thomas, a man whose own past was equally riddled with secrets. It was clear that Thomas had become entangled in Grayson's schemes long before Eleanor ever became involved. But it wasn't just the personal ties that sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. It was the fact that these two men had been working together, manipulating the lives of others in their pursuit of something darker, something more dangerous than Miss Marple could have anticipated. It seemed that Thomas and Grayson had been involved in an illicit business, one that used the isolation of the lighthouse to their advantage. They had been conducting covert operations under the cover of darkness, taking advantage of the location's remoteness to hide their activities from the rest of the village. But things had gone wrong when Eleanor discovered the truth. It was as if Grayson had realized the full extent of his mistakes when Eleanor had begun to piece together the puzzle. Her discovery of the operations had caused a rift, a fracture in the delicate balance they had so carefully constructed. Thomas had begun to fear that Eleanor's knowledge could expose them, and Grayson had been too blinded by his own arrogance to see the danger. In his eyes, Eleanor was expendable. She had become a liability, and her disappearance was no more than a necessary evil. As Miss Marple's mind churned with the details, she realized that the motive behind the crime wasn't just greed or revenge. It was a need for control. Grayson had never truly wanted Eleanor to be free. He had sought to control her, to dominate every aspect of her life, as he had done with everyone else who had come into his orbit. Her curiosity, her intelligence, had been her downfall. And now, in the depths of this lighthouse, Miss Marple understood what was at stake. A man willing to go to any lengths to keep his secrets buried, to maintain the life he had carefully constructed. The sheriff's voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Marple, what have you found?" She turned to him, the realization settling in. It's not just about money or revenge. This is about a man so consumed with control that he was willing to destroy anyone who threatened his world. Grayson thought he could manipulate everyone, even those he claimed to love. But now it's clear he's not the only one with something to hide. Thomas, too, has blood on his hands. And together, they've created a web of lies that stretches far beyond the eye. Lighthouse, the sheriff's face hardened as the truth settled in. He had been right all along. There was far more at play here than anyone had imagined. And now, it was up to him and Miss Marple to bring it all to light before it was too late. The tension was almost unbearable as Miss Marple and the sheriff prepared for the final confrontation. The lighthouse, standing tall and silent against the darkened sky, seemed to echo with the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. Inside, the wall still carried the secrets of years gone by, the faintest whisper of a lie hanging in the air. Miss Marple had already devised her plan. It was simple, elegant, and most importantly, effective. Grayson and Thomas were both arrogant, blinded by their own belief that they could manipulate everyone around them. They had underestimated her, and now she would use that underestimation to her advantage. The sheriff was stationed at the back of the lighthouse, ready to move if necessary. Miss Marple had arranged for him to stay out of sight so as not to alert their quarry. The key was getting Grayson or Thomas, or preferably both, into the trap she had set without them realizing it until it was too late. She had to move carefully, ensuring that every step would lead her to the inevitable conclusion. She waited, in the center of the lighthouse, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. There was a faint rustling sound from the other side of the room, and she knew that they were getting closer. Grayson had been elusive since the journal's discovery, but she knew now that he was close to unraveling his own thread. Thomas, on the other hand, was growing increasingly paranoid, his every move now driven by a sense of desperation. The door creaked open and she heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. Her heartbeat quickened, but she kept her composure. She knew that Grayson and Thomas would not be alone in this. One of them would attempt to take control, to dominate the situation. They were used to doing so, after all. As she expected, Grayson emerged from the shadows first, his face taut with a mixture of frustration and anger. Behind him, Thomas appeared, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting something to jump out from the darkness. "You." Grayson's voice was low, almost a growl. "I should have known you'd be involved in this." Miss Marple took a step forward, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "It's over, Mr. Grayson, and you've already lost." Thomas looked between them, his face pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the door, as if contemplating an escape. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Lost? You think you've won? You don't know what you're dealing with." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Mr. Grayson. You and Thomas both have been playing a dangerous game, but you made a fatal mistake. You underestimated me." The words hit like a cold gust of wind, and for a moment, Grayson seemed to hesitate. It wasn't fear, but something else. A recognition that this was the endgame. His posture stiffened, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't going down without a fight. "You think you can take me down with a few accusations?" Grayson sneered. "You don't have the evidence. You don't have anything." Miss Marple's lips curled into a slight smile. "I have more than you think." With a quick motion, she pulled out the journal she had found earlier, the one that had contained the hidden truths, the dark confessions of men who thought they could evade the truth. She held it up, the pages fluttering as if alive, revealing the damning details of their crimes. You left behind a trail, Mr. Grayson. A trail that you thought no one would follow. But it was there all along, hidden in plain sight. You were so careful with your lies that you never realized how much you revealed. Grayson's expression shifted, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw the crack in his armor. His eyes flicked to Thomas, who was still standing there, visibly shaking, but trying to maintain his composure. The tension in the room heightened, and Miss Marple could feel the air grow thick with impending action. You think that journal means anything? Grayson spat, stepping toward her. That's just a collection of paranoid ramblings. You have nothing concrete. Oh, but I do, Miss Marple replied coolly. She nodded slightly. And from the shadows behind her, the sheriff emerged, holding a small envelope. This, Mr. Grayson, is what you left behind. I had it checked. Fingerprints, the works. Your fingerprints are all over it. The moment the words left her mouth, Thomas froze. His gaze darted back and forth as if he were trying to process what he had just heard. His nervousness had grown too obvious now, and Grayson, despite his bravado, could no longer hide his discomfort. You... Thomas began to protest, but Miss Marple raised her hand, silencing him. No more lies, Thomas, she said gently. You can't escape the truth anymore. Grayson's hand twitched, as if he were about to make a move, but Miss Marple was already one step ahead. She knew that he would attempt to deny it all, to manipulate his way out of this corner. But there was no escape now. Did you think that because you were wealthy, powerful, and untouchable, you could erase the past? She continued, her voice calm, yet piercing. Did you think that with your manipulations, your schemes, your ability to bend others to your will, you could erase what you'd done? You thought you had it all under control, but now it's clear. You've been playing a losing game from the start. Grayson's expression shifted once again, this time to one of fury. He lunged forward, but the sheriff was there, moving swiftly to intercept him. There was no escape now, not for Grayson, and certainly not for Thomas. The game had ended, and the truth had caught up with them both. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the steady thrum of the storm outside and the muffled sounds of Grayson's protests being silenced. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her composure unwavering. It was done. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. The truth had been uncovered, the lies laid bare, and the criminals, once so certain of their victory, now found themselves facing the inevitable consequences of their actions. As the sheriff handcuffed Grayson and Thomas, Miss Marple looked out the window, the distant storm finally beginning to subside. The night seemed quieter now, as if the world had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment to arrive. It was over. The case had been solved. The handcuffs clicked around Grayson's wrists, and Thomas, trembling, was escorted to a nearby chair, his face pale under the harsh light of the lighthouse. Miss Marple watched them both carefully, her mind already moving past their capture, her thoughts never slowing. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, and with it, the tension in the room seemed to lift, but Miss Marple knew that wasn't the end. As the sheriff finished speaking with the two men, his back turned toward her. Miss Marple took a moment to study the lighthouse again. There was something not quite right about this place, the sense that all was not as it seemed, even in the final moments. She'd learned long ago to trust her instincts. And something was gnawing at her, making her uneasy. She was about to speak when a sudden, uninvited sound broke the silence. A faint creak came from above them, the sound of footsteps echoing from the floor above. Her brow furrowed slightly. The only people who should have been in the lighthouse were Grace and Thomas, the sheriff, and herself. "Sheriff," Miss Marple called softly, her voice calm but urgent. "Check the upper floors." The sheriff looked at her quizzically, a flash of confusion crossing his face, but he didn't question her. He gave a brief nod and made his way up the narrow staircase, disappearing into the dim light of the upper landing. The room was quiet once more, save for the distant crash of the waves against the rocks below. Grayson, seated in front of her, remained sullen, though the defiant glint in his eye had softened. Thomas, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, as if his mind was racing to make sense of the events that had unfolded. Miss Marple knew this wasn't over. It never was. Not completely. Seconds later, the sheriff reappeared, his face ashen. "There's someone up there," he said, his voice tight with shock. "It's not Grayson. It's not Thomas. Someone else." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced quickly, processing the implications. Someone else? She had considered all the possible suspects, all the likely individuals involved. But this was a new layer, an unexpected complication. Without waiting for further explanation, she stood up, her voice now firm. "Show me." The sheriff led the way up the staircase, his hand resting on the revolver at his side. Miss Marple followed closely behind, each step bringing her closer to the answers she feared might exist just beyond reach. They arrived at the top floor, and as the sheriff pushed open the creaking door, the sight that greeted them was chilling. Standing by the window, bathed in the weak light from the storm's dying fury, was a figure Miss Marple hadn't expected to see. Maggie Bennet, the housekeeper. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was no mistaking the cold, calculated look in her expression. She turned slowly to face them, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood, Miss Marple," Maggie said, her voice smooth and eerily calm. "It's never been about the money or the power. It's far more personal than that." For a long moment, Miss Marple simply stared at her, her mind working at a dizzying pace, trying to piece together what was happening. Maggie Bennet had always seemed so unassuming, so quiet. But this was something else entirely. "You," Miss Marple said, her voice a whisper, "you've been behind this all along." Maggie didn't deny it. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Miss Marple's. "You've been following the wrong trail, Miss Marple. The pieces you've gathered, Grayson, Thomas, they were pawns, nothing more. It was always about revenge, not just for money." A cold chill ran through Miss Marple. She had been so focused on the obvious, so certain of the connections between the men, she hadn't considered that someone far closer to the case might have been pulling the strings. But it made sense now. The pieces that hadn't quite fit, the odd sense of familiarity from the start, it was all connected. "I was never going to let him get away with it," Maggie continued, her voice shaking slightly, but her eyes were burning with an intense fury. "He took everything from me. My family, my reputation. And when he thought he could just wash his hands of it all, That's when I took matters into my own hands. He didn't just ruin my life. He ruined everything I stood for. I'm the one who's been living with the consequences of his actions for far too long. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the moment, the shock of the revelation. Maggie wasn't just another victim, as Miss Marple had believed all along. She was the true architect of the entire conspiracy, the one who had orchestrated the downfall of those she had once served. "You killed Marcus Grayson," Miss Marple said, the words heavy in the air. "But you didn't just stop there, did you? You had Thomas involved, making him think he could control the situation while you worked in the shadows." Maggie's smile widened, though there was no joy in it, only bitterness. "I didn't just kill him, Miss Marple. I made sure he suffered first. I made him feel every ounce of the pain he caused. And then, when it was too late for him to stop I ended his life." The sheriff moved forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. She had everything she needed. The true mastermind had revealed herself. But now it was about justice. "Why go to such lengths?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "Why frame Grayson and Thomas? Why not just confront Marcus directly?" Maggie's expression hardened, and for a moment she seemed lost in her thoughts. "Because it was never about just him. It was about them all. I wanted them to feel as I had, to understand the depth of the betrayal, but mostly it was about making them feel powerless, to watch them scramble for answers, all while I was right under their noses." In that moment, Miss Marple realized just how deeply twisted Maggie's need for vengeance had become. She had turned the entire investigation into her own game, manipulating the authorities, creating false trails, and making everyone, including Miss Marple, believe they were solving the case. But now, the truth was out, and Maggie Bennett had nowhere left to hide. The room was still, the heavy silence broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. Maggie Bennett stood facing Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to come to terms with the gravity of her own words. For a moment, she appeared almost vulnerable, exhausted from the game she had been playing, yet unwilling to concede the final step. The sheriff remained frozen, his hand still gripping the revolver at his side, his breath shallow. He had never seen such a cold determination in a suspect before, certainly not in someone who had once been so invisible to the authorities. And now, it was all unraveling, piece by piece. He didn't know whether to feel relief or horror. "Maggie," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying a note of finality, "you've made one critical mistake." The woman's eyes flickered, her facade of calm cracking for a brief instant. "What's that?" she asked, her tone venomous. "You've underestimated the value of small details," Miss Marple answered. "You see, most people would have overlooked the signs you so carefully planted. But I didn't." Maggie's lips curled into a tight smile. "Oh? And what signs would those be, Miss Marple? The ones you think you've figured out?" Her voice had a mocking edge, but there was a tremor of uncertainty beneath it. Miss Marple stepped forward, her sharp gaze never leaving the woman. It was subtle, but there were things that didn't add up. The way you reacted when I mentioned your past, your hesitance when I asked about your relationship with Marcus Grayson. You were too focused on playing the victim, Maggie. It was a clever ruse, but you slipped. You assumed that by distancing yourself from the key players you would remain unseen. Yet it was in your reaction to every question about Marcus that gave you away. Maggie's expression faltered, but she quickly masked it with a brittle smile. You think you're so clever, don't you? A few questions, a few comments, and you think you've solved everything. Well, Miss Marple, you're wrong. You've caught me, but it won't change anything. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering, it changes everything. You see, Maggie, your need for revenge, your obsession with making them pay, blinded you. The crucial piece of the puzzle was right in front of us. You never thought anyone would look closely enough to see it. The sheriff shifted uneasily. What's she talking about, Miss Marple? He asked, glancing between the two women. Small details, Miss Marple repeated, nodding. Take the time Grayson spent at the lighthouse. The way he seemed so certain of his own safety, so convinced no one could catch him. It was a deliberate arrogance, a confidence that came from knowing something the rest of us didn't. But there was one thing that didn't fit. The state of the light in the lighthouse. The sheriff blinked in confusion. The light? Yes, Miss Marple said, turning to face him. When the storm hit, the lighthouse light wasn't operating properly. It had been tampered with. A small but crucial piece of information that anyone who was actually familiar with the lighthouse would have noticed. Maggie, you knew exactly where the wiring was weak. You knew how to sabotage it. And you knew how to make it look like an accident. But you didn't count on the fact that I'd remember that detail. Maggie's face turned a shade paler. You think that's enough to tie me to everything? She sneered. A minor detail like that. No, Maggie, Miss Marple said, her voice cool and deliberate. That light was the key to understanding what happened the night of the murder. But what you didn't count on was my remembering something else. You spoke of your past, but you forgot one thing. The fact that you never mentioned the incident at the Dellingham estate. The one that happened years ago, when you were just a young woman working as a maid, a fire, just like the one that nearly claimed the lighthouse. Maggie stiffened, her eyes widening, and for a moment, she looked less like a calm criminal and more like a terrified woman trapped in her own lies. Maggie began, her voice faltering for a brief moment. But she quickly regained composure. You can't prove anything from that. Oh, but I can, Miss Marple said softly. That fire was never solved. It was always thought to be an accident, but I've learned that the pattern of sabotage, the manipulation of light and fire, was no coincidence. You've used it before, Maggie, first at Dellingham, and now here at the lighthouse. It was your way of controlling the narrative, of making sure no one could discover what you were really up to. Maggie's face twisted in frustration. You're a fool, Miss Marple. You think you've got me, but I've already won. It's over. No one can stop what's coming. Before Miss Marple could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted the tense silence. The sheriff turned quickly, his hand gripping his gun again instinctively, but it was only the deputy, his face pale, who stepped in. Sheriff, the deputy said, his voice trembling. There's been another development. There's been an incident. The rest of the evidence, it's gone. It's been stolen. We've found the records, papers, files. Everything's been wiped clean. The sheriff looked at Miss Marple in horror. For a brief moment, everything seemed to hang in the air like a fragile thread ready to snap. Grayson, Thomas, even Maggie. None of it had been enough to stop the true mastermind. But now, as Maggie stood in front of them, her words took on a chilling new meaning. You see, Maggie said, her smile returning with chilling confidence, you're too late. In that instant, Miss Marple's mind raced, her thoughts churning. The truth was here, but the game wasn't finished. No, Maggie had outsmarted them all, slipping through their grasp, just as they thought they had won. The sheriff, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury, was about to speak when a quiet, sharp voice interrupted him. "Sheriff," Miss Marple said calmly, "there's one more thing we've overlooked." The sheriff froze, and Miss Marple turned her gaze to the floor. There, just barely visible beneath the dust, was a small scrap of paper, overlooked in the frenzy of their capture. A final piece. "I've won," Maggie whispered, her voice laced with a cold satisfaction. "You'll never catch me now." But as Miss Marple bent down, her hand brushed against the crumpled paper, her fingers wrapping around the evidence. They had missed. Just one more detail. One more twist. With a sigh, Miss Marple stood and faced the sheriff, her eyes determined. "It's not over. Not yet." The game was far from finished. And no matter how far Maggie ran, Miss Marple would always be one step ahead. Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit room, her fingers still lightly clutching the small, crumpled piece of paper. Her sharp eyes scanned it carefully, but the hurried scribble, hastily hidden in the corner of the sheriff's office, gave little away. It was a name, a single word, barely legible. For a brief moment she felt the weight of the case pressing against her. But the sensation quickly passed, replaced by the faintest sense of satisfaction. Maggie Bennet had been unmasked, her deceptions laid bare. The motive, twisted as it was, had been uncovered. Justice was, it seemed, finally within reach. The paper in her hand tugged at her thoughts. There was something about it, something that didn't quite align with the conclusion she'd drawn. The mystery had been solved, or so she had thought. And yet, this small scrap, this trivial afterthought in the grand scheme of the investigation, insisted there was more. The sheriff paced at the edge of the room, his hands shaking slightly as he watched Miss Marple. "What is it, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and unease. She slowly raised her gaze, her expression thoughtful. "It's just a hunch," she said quietly. "A small detail I've been overlooking. It may mean nothing at all, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something else going on here. Something still hidden." He looked at her, a frown knitting his brows. "After all of this, you think there's more to it?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room one more time. The clues that had led them to Maggie had been scattered, intricate, and confusing. Yet they had fit together with an undeniable logic. But now, as she stared at the hastily scrawled word, a sense of unease began to settle in. It was as though she had glimpsed the shape of something larger just beyond the edges of the puzzle. The sheriff looked between her and the paper, still unsure. "Are we talking about another case? Or is this something else entirely?" "I'm not sure," Miss Marple said slowly, tucking the scrap into the pocket of her coat. "But there's something about that name. It's too deliberate to be meaningless. Whoever left it knew we'd find it. And I don't believe Maggie's the only one with secrets she's not ready to share." The sheriff stared at her, his confusion deepening. "You think someone's pulling strings behind the scenes?" Miss Marple turned toward the door, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's possible. But for now, I need to think it over. Sometimes the most important pieces of the puzzle are the ones we overlook until we're ready to see them clearly. With one last glance at the sheriff, she stepped out of the office and into the cool evening air. The tension of the case had lifted, but a different weight settled in its place. As she walked down the quiet street, the lights of the town flickering in the distance, her thoughts drifted back to that name, the name she hadn't shared with the sheriff. It was familiar, yet distant, like the echo of a memory long buried. There was a deeper thread running through this case. She could feel it. And it was not something she could let go so easily. Miss Marple's footsteps were steady as she made her way back to her small cottage, the chill of the evening air brushing against her face. She had solved the crime, no doubt about that. But her mind was already working, unraveling the strange feeling in her chest that told her the end of this case wasn't really the end at all. Once inside, she sat at her desk, the soft light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. She pulled out a notebook, jotting down the cryptic word that had sparked her curiosity. Her hand paused over the page as she stared at the inked letters. It was a name that didn't belong in this case. Yet it somehow did. The name seemed to call to her, urging her to dig deeper, to search for something that wasn't immediately visible. And as always, Miss Marple's instincts were rarely wrong. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window into the darkened street. The quiet of the night held a sense of finality, but she knew better. The mysteries of the world never truly ended. They lingered, sometimes just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Her eyes narrowed as the puzzle pieces clicked together in her mind, shifting once more, just out of reach. And then she smiled. Perhaps Maggie Bennet had been the key to solving this particular puzzle, but there was another one, somewhere on the horizon, one that would lead her down a different path, a path she had not yet walked, but one she would soon find. As Miss Marple turned back to her desk, her pen in hand, the feeling of certainty returned. The mystery she had just solved was a prelude to something far larger, something more elusive, just waiting to be uncovered. And it was only a matter of time before she, with her sharp eye and patient mind, would be the one to uncover it. The case wasn't over. It had never truly ended. And Miss Marple knew with quiet confidence that this would not be the last of the puzzle she would piece together. There were more waiting, more that only she could solve. With a soft chuckle to herself, Miss Marple set the pen to the paper again, ready for the next mystery to unfold. And as the moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the sleepy town, the question lingered, the answers always just beyond reach. For a detective like Miss Marple, the mystery never truly ends.